The plane was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet, slicing through the quiet blue sky like a silver blade. Inside the cabin, everything felt normal, almost boring. Seatbelt signs were off. The hum of the engines blended with soft conversations, the rustle of snack wrappers, and the occasional laugh. Some passengers were asleep, heads resting against windows. Others scrolled endlessly on their phones. A few stared out into the endless clouds, lost in thought. No one sensed danger. No one imagined that in just a few seconds their lives would change forever. Then it happened. A violent explosion tore through the aircraft. The sound was not like thunder, it was sharper. Closer, as if the sky itself had cracked open. The plane shuddered violently, throwing people against their seats. Luggage compartments burst open. Bags, shoes, and loose items flew through the cabin like missiles. Screams filled the air. Before anyone could even understand what was happening, the cabin lights flickered, once, twice, and then dimmed. A loud mechanical warning blared overhead, sharp and relentless. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling all at once, swinging wildly like dozens of white ghosts. "Put on your mask first," a recorded voice repeated calmly, cruelly calm. Panic erupted. Passengers fumbled with straps, hands shaking, breaths coming fast and shallow. Some couldn't get their masks to work. Others clutched them desperately, gasping for air that suddenly felt thin and distant. A child screamed for her mother. An elderly man clutched his chest. A woman sobbed uncontrollably, whispering prayers under her breath. The plane tilted sharply to the left. Someone shouted, "What's happening?" Then the cockpit door burst open. It slammed against the wall with a terrifying crash. Two pilots stumbled out. Their faces were pale, almost gray. Sweat soaked through their uniforms. Their eyes were wide with raw, unfiltered fear. One of them screamed. Not into the intercom, not with professional control. He screamed like a man who had seen death standing right in front of him. "We're already dead." The words hit the cabin harder than the explosion. A wave of terror swept through the passengers. People froze, some screamed louder, others went silent, as if their minds refused to process what they had just heard. Pilots were not supposed to say things like that. Pilots were trained, pilots stayed calm, pilots saved people. But these pilots looked broken. The other pilot grabbed the seat back to steady himself, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "The autopilot is gone," he shouted, voice cracking. "It just shut down." The first pilot ran a hand through his hair, breathing fast. "One engine's on fire," he said. "We've lost control." Those words echoed through the cabin. Lost control. Passengers began crying openly now. Some dropped to their knees in the aisle, praying aloud. Some clutched their loved ones, holding them as if that alone could protect them from the sky. Others pulled out their phones with trembling hands, recording videos, leaving voice messages, typing goodbye texts they never thought they would write. "I love you," one man whispered into his phone. "Take care of the kids," another said through tears. Flight attendants tried to move through the chaos, but fear had taken hold of everyone, including them. Their training told them to stay calm, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were terrified too. The plane jolted again, dropping suddenly. People screamed as their stomachs lurched upward. The sound of metal groaning echoed through the aircraft. Somewhere deep inside, something was very wrong. Smoke began to creep in from the front of the plane, thin at first, barely noticeable. Then thicker. A burning smell filled the air. The pilots exchanged a look that needed no words. This was bad. This was very bad. "Brace position," one flight attendant shouted, her voice shaking. Passengers bent forward, hands over their heads, hearts pounding so hard it felt like they might burst. And then nothing. For a strange, terrifying moment, the plane leveled out. The screaming softened. The alarms continued, but the sudden drop stopped. People looked around in confusion, hope flickering weakly in their eyes. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't going to die. That was when something unexpected happened. In the middle of the chaos, near the window of row 23, sat a young girl. She was small, too small to be noticed in all this panic. Her feet barely touched the floor, her oxygen mask hung properly over her face, the elastic secured just like it was supposed to be. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming, she wasn't praying or calling anyone, she was watching. Her dark eyes moved carefully from detail to detail, the shaking wings, the flickering lights, the panicked faces, the open cockpit door. She listened, she heard the words the pilots said, she noticed the alarms, she felt the way the plane responded to the air. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, not from fear, but from concentration. Her heart was racing, but her mind was doing something strange. It was working. She remembered sitting beside her father in a small flight simulator years ago. She remembered the feel of the control yoke in her hands. She remembered his voice, "Don't panic. Panic kills pilots." Her chest tightened. She looked around again. No one noticed her, not the crying passengers, not the terrified flight attendants, not the pilots arguing in frantic whispers near the cockpit door. To them, she was just another scared child on a failing plane, but inside her mind, something was happening. A realization, a terrible, impossible realization. If no one took control soon, this plane wasn't going to make it. She swallowed hard and removed one hand from her lap. Her fingers trembled slightly. Outside the window, clouds rushed past faster than before. Time was running out, and still no one noticed her, not yet. The girl stood up. At first, no one noticed. In a cabin filled with sobs, prayers, and panicked voices, the movement of one small figure barely registered. People were too busy gripping armrests, holding loved ones, or staring blankly at the floor, preparing themselves for an ending they could no longer avoid. But she stood anyway. The plane jolted again, dipping slightly, and she steadied herself against the seatbacks as she moved into the aisle. Her oxygen mask swayed gently as she walked forward, step by careful step toward the open cockpit door. A flight attendant saw her then. "Sweetheart, no." The woman cried, reaching out instinctively. Her hand grabbed the girl's arm. "You need to stay seated," the attendant said, panic sharpening her voice. "It's not safe." The girl looked up at her. Her eyes were calm, not empty, not frozen, calm. "I need to go forward," the girl said quietly. The attendant shook her head, tears streaking down her face. "Please, go back. Please, the girl spoke again, her voice steady enough to cut through the noise around them. "My father is a flight instructor," she said. "I've trained on simulators." The words hung in the air. For a moment the flight attendant just stared at her, as if she hadn't heard correctly. You're a child," she whispered. "I know," the girl replied, "but I also know what those alarms mean." The attendant's grip loosened. Behind them, another violent warning tone shrieked through the cabin. The plane dipped again, sharper this time, and screams rose once more. The flight attendant swallowed hard. Then she stepped aside. The girl walked forward. As she reached the cockpit doorway, the pilots turned toward her. For a split second, neither of them spoke. Then the first pilot let out a short, broken laugh. "You've got to be kidding me," he said hoarsely. The second pilot wiped sweat from his forehead, eyes darting between the flickering instruments and the small figure standing before him. "This is not the time for jokes," he snapped weakly. "I'm not joking," the girl said. Her voice didn't shake. The first pilot laughed again, but this time it sounded wrong, hollow, desperate. "A kid," he said, pressing a hand to his face. "We're trusting our lives to a kid now." He took a step back, then his knees buckled. The sound of his body hitting the cockpit floor cut through the alarms. "Captain," the second pilot shouted, lunging forward. The girl froze for half a second, just long enough for fear to flare in her chest. Then she pushed it down. The second pilot knelt beside his fallen partner, checking for a pulse. "Unconscious," he muttered. "Shock, maybe worse." Another alarm screamed louder than before. The plane lurched downward violently, throwing the pilot against the side panel. He barely caught himself, gripping the console with white, knuckled hands. The altimeter needle spun. They were losing altitude fast. The pilot tried to steady his breathing, but his hands betrayed him. They shook so badly he couldn't even keep them on the controls. I can't, he stammered. He looked up at the girl. Really looked at her this time. She was small, young, completely out of place in a cockpit filled with smoke, alarms, and flashing red lights. And yet she was standing, focused, watching the instruments. She pointed to a screen. "Your right engine is overheating," she said. "You need to shut it down before it flames out completely." The pilot stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I've seen this failure in simulation," she replied. Twice another jolt rocked the plane. The pilot laughed weakly. "Simulation," he repeated. "We're not in a simulator." "No," the girl said. "But the physics don't care." The words hit him harder than he expected. He followed her gaze to the instrument panel. She was right. The numbers were wrong, dangerously wrong. The pilot swallowed. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." He reached for the control, then stopped. His hands were still shaking too badly. Outside the cockpit, passengers screamed as the plane dropped again. Someone slammed into the cockpit doorframe. The girl stepped closer. "Let me help," she said. The pilot hesitated. Years of training screamed at him that this was insane, unthinkable, against every rule he had ever learned. But another truth screamed louder. He was losing control, and she wasn't. Smoke thickened in the cockpit. His vision blurred. "God help us," he whispered. Then he looked at her and asked the question he never imagined he would ask. "Do you know how to land this thing?" The cockpit went silent except for the alarms. The girl didn't answer right away. She looked at the controls, the throttle, the yoke, the glowing screens that mirrored images she had seen 100 times before, on screens much smaller than these. Her mind raced. Landing a real aircraft wasn't the same as a simulator. She knew that. She knew the risks. She knew how little room there was for error. Her heart pounded in her chest. Then she thought of the cabin. The crying children, the praying parents, the strangers holding each other like family. She looked back at the pilot. "And she nodded. "Yes," she said, "but you have to listen to me." The pilot exhaled a shaky breath. "All right," he whispered. "All right." He slid out of the captain's seat. "Your controls," he said. The girl climbed into the seat. Her feet barely reached the pedals. She adjusted the seat forward, movements careful but confident. Her hands closed around the control yoke. It felt heavier than she remembered, more real. The plane shuddered again, and her grip tightened. "Okay," she said softly. "First, we stabilize." She adjusted the controls gently. The alarms continued screaming. But slowly, just barely, the wild shaking began to lessen. The pilot watched in stunned silence. For the first time since the explosion, the plane wasn't falling. The girl stared at the instruments, her face serious beyond her years. Outside the cockpit, no one knew what was happening. Inside it, something impossible had just begun, and for the first time since the words "we're already dead" had been spoken, there was a fragile, terrifying thing in the air. Hope. The girl wrapped her fingers around the control yoke. It was heavier than she expected, solid, unyielding, alive beneath her hands. The aircraft responded instantly to even the smallest movement, as if it were testing her, waiting to see whether she would hesitate. Her feet stretched forward. They barely reached the pedals. She slid forward in the seat again, straining just enough to apply pressure. The motion sent a ripple of pain through her legs, but she ignored it. Pain was noise. Noise could be ignored. Smoke thickened in the cockpit, curling along the ceiling like dark fingers. The air tasted sharp and burned her throat. Warning lights flashed in violent reds and ambers, painting the cockpit in a strobing glow. Behind her, the remaining pilot coughed and turned his head away. "Take it slow," he rasped. "Don't overcorrect." She nodded without looking back. Her hands trembled. She felt it, the tiny, uncontrollable shaking in her fingers, the tension climbing her arms. Fear was there, rising fast, clawing at her chest. But her voice stayed calm. "Pitch first," she said quietly, "then roll." The pilot stared at her. She spoke like someone who had done this before. She inhaled slowly through her nose, forcing her breathing to match the rhythm she'd practiced so many times before. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, clear as if he were sitting beside her. Trust the instruments, not your fear. Her eyes locked onto the artificial horizon, not the smoke, not the shaking, not the screams echoing faintly from the cabin. Just the instruments. The plane lurched suddenly to the right. She corrected gently. Too much force would send them into a spiral. She remembered that. Over-control killed more pilots than engine failure ever did. Easy, she whispered. The yoke responded. The aircraft began to level. The screaming alarm shifted tones, still loud, still urgent, but different now. The pilot blinked. You stabilized us, he said, disbelief creeping into his voice. Temporarily, she replied. We still have an engine fire. She glanced at the engine display. Temperature climbing, pressure unstable. If it failed catastrophically, they wouldn't have time to react. She reached toward the overhead panel. The pilot stiffened. Wait, I know, she said, confirming. She double-checked the numbers, referenced the indicators. Exactly like the simulator, except now this was real. She swallowed hard, shutting down the right engine. She announced, her voice firm. She flipped the switch. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the engine power dropped. The vibration changed. The sound of the aircraft shifted, deeper now, uneven but controlled. The fire warning blinked once, twice, then went dark. The cockpit fell strangely quiet, not silent, never silent, but calmer. The pilot let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You just saved the wing, he said. She didn't respond. She was already adjusting thrust on the remaining engine, trimming the aircraft to compensate for asymmetric power. Her feet pressed unevenly on the pedals, muscles burning as she fought to keep the nose aligned. The plane fought her. The sky never surrendered easily. Outside the cockpit, passengers felt the change. The violent shaking eased just enough for hope to stir, fragile, uncertain, but real. Inside, sweat ran down the girl's back. She wiped one hand against her jeans and kept flying. We need help, the pilot said hoarsely. We need ATC, she nodded. Her eyes flicked to the radio panel. She had practiced this part too, hundreds of times. Her thumb hovered over the transmit button. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What if they don't believe me? What if I say the wrong thing? What if my voice gives me away? Her father's voice answered before fear could finish. Clear, calm, correct. She pressed the button. Mayday, 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 she said. Her voice cut cleanly through the static. Steady, controlled, unmistakably serious. This is Flight 782. We have suffered an engine failure and loss of autopilot. I am manually flying the aircraft. The words hung in the cockpit. The pilot turned toward her sharply. You told them you are flying. He whispered. She didn't look at him. I am, she replied. Static crackled. Seconds stretched unbearably long. The girl adjusted pitch again as the plane drifted slightly off level. She corrected without thinking now, her body moving ahead of fear, ahead of doubt. Finally a voice came through the radio. Flight 782, say again. She pressed the button again. Mayday, I am flying the aircraft, she repeated. Request immediate vectors and emergency landing assistance. Silence. The radio hissed softly. On the ground, air traffic controllers stared at their screens, certain they had misheard. A child? No. Impossible. The pilot leaned closer to the microphone, ready to take over. But she raised a hand, stopping him. Wait, she said. She kept the plane steady, every correction precise. The radio crackled again. Flight 782, who is the pilot in command? She closed her eyes for half a second. Then she answered, my name is, she paused. I am a trained simulator pilot. The captain is incapacitated. The first officer is assisting. Another long pause. The pilot beside her whispered, they won't accept this. They don't have to, she replied. They just have to help. The plane jolted suddenly, turbulence ripping through the fuselage. The girl tightened her grip, fighting the instinct to pull back too hard. Easy, easy. The instruments steadied again. Her breathing slowed. Finally, the radio came alive. Flight 782, we are standing by. Confirm altitude and heading. She answered instantly, rattling off the numbers without hesitation. There was no more disbelief in the voice that responded, only shock and urgency. Flight 782, radar contact confirmed. We will guide you down. The pilot's eyes filled with tears. "You did it," he whispered. The girl didn't smile. She stared straight ahead, jaw set, hands firm on the controls. "This is only the beginning," she said quietly. Outside the cockpit, the clouds began to thin. Far below, somewhere unseen, a runway waited. And between it and the sky stood one small girl, fighting gravity, fear, and fate itself. The clouds began to thin. At first it was just a faint glow, barely noticeable through the gray chaos outside the windshield. Then slowly, unmistakably, lights appeared, runway lights, perfectly straight, perfectly real. The girl's heart slammed against her chest, but her hands stayed steady on the controls. She leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as she focused on the approach path the controllers had been guiding her toward for the last few agonizing minutes. "There," she whispered, "I see it." The pilot beside her let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You've got the runway," he said, "you really do." But there was no celebration yet. This was the most dangerous part. The wind slammed into the aircraft like a living thing, howling around the fuselage, pushing against the wings with violent force. The plane shook hard enough to rattle the panels and send another wave of fear through the cabin. Passengers screamed again, gripping armrests as the ground rushed closer. The girl adjusted the yoke carefully, just a few degrees. Too much, and they would stall. Too little, and they would overshoot the runway. Her feet pressed against the pedals, legs burning, muscles trembling under the strain. Sweat ran into her eyes, but she didn't blink. "Crosswind," she said calmly, correcting. The pilot stared at her in awe. She spoke like a veteran. Inside her mind, everything narrowed to numbers, angles, and movement. Airspeed, altitude, glide slope. She tuned out the noise, the fear, the impossible weight of what she was doing. "Trust the instruments, not your fear." Her father's voice was steady, constant. The aircraft dipped suddenly, caught in a pocket of turbulent air. Gasps filled the cockpit. The girl reacted instantly, correcting, stabilizing, easing the nose back into alignment. The runway lights shifted slightly in her vision, then snapped back into place. Good. The pilot breathed. That was good. They were low now, so low she could see details on the ground service roads, vehicles pulled aside, emergency lights flashing red and blue like a living carpet of anticipation. Fire trucks, ambulances, dozens of them, all waiting for her. The radio crackled. "Flight 782, you are clear to land. Wind is strong but steady. You're doing great." She didn't answer right away. She was too focused. Her hands adjusted the throttle slow, controlled, exactly as she had practiced 100 times before, except this time the consequences were real. The plane descended through the final layer of clouds, and suddenly the runway was fully visible. Straight ahead. Centered, perfect, the girl aligned the aircraft with precision that felt almost unreal, her movements smooth despite the shaking, despite the roar of wind screaming around them. The plane fought her one last time, rocking violently. Passengers cried out. A flight attendant braced herself against a seat, whispering, "Please, please." The girl leaned forward slightly. "Almost there," she said, not to anyone else but to herself. The ground rushed up. The numbers ticked down. 50 feet, 30, 20, hold it, hold it. The pilot murmured. The girl eased back gently on the yoke. The plane floated for a breathless moment. Then the wheels hit the runway hard. The impact thundered through the aircraft, jarring every bone, slamming passengers against their seats. For half a second, no one knew if they would bounce back into the air or break apart. Then the wheels stayed down. The aircraft shuddered violently as the tires screamed against the pavement. The girl pushed the nose down carefully. Engaged reverse thrust, pressed the brakes. The plane slowed, faster, slower, steady. The roar of the engines faded. And then silence, not the terrifying silence of falling through the sky, but the quiet of something finished. For one long, unbelievable moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Passengers looked around in stunned disbelief, waiting for something else to go wrong. Nothing did. Then a sound rose from the back of the cabin, a sob, then another, and suddenly the plane exploded with emotion. Applause thundered through the cabin. People screamed, laughed, cried all at once. Strangers grabbed each other, hugging tightly, some collapsing into the aisle in relief. A man kissed the floor, a woman clutched her child and wept openly. Flight attendants cried without shame. Lives had been saved, all of them. In the cockpit, the pilot covered his face with his hands and broke down completely. She did it, he whispered through tears. She actually did it. The girl sat very still. Her hands were still on the controls. They were shaking now, not from fear, but from everything she had been holding back. She released the yoke slowly. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, lights flashing against the darkening sky. Doors opened, fresh air rushed in. Applause followed her as she stepped out of the cockpit. Passengers reached for her hands, touching her shoulders, thanking her through tears, through laughter, through disbelief. You saved us. You're a miracle. You're our hero. She didn't know what to say. She was just a kid again, overwhelmed, exhausted, eyes wide with the weight of what had happened. Later, as the story spread across the world, headlines would struggle to explain it: a child, a failing plane, an impossible landing. Experts would analyze every detail. News channels would replay the footage again and again. People would argue whether it should have been possible at all. But for the people on that plane, there was no debate. They were alive, because when fear took over the sky, one small girl refused to let it win. That day, the world learned a powerful lesson. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. They don't always have titles or medals. Sometimes they're just kids who refuse to give up.